November 1914. A ship named Endurance cuts through stormy seas at the edge of the world. On board are 28 men, led by a restless dreamer, Sir Ernest Shackleton. His goal? Nothing less than the impossible: to march across the frozen heart of Antarctica, a place where no human being has ever walked from coast to coast. No GPS, no radios, no satellites. Only wooden ships, canvas sails, and sheer human determination. Temperatures fall below minus 50 degrees Celsius. Storms rage with winds strong enough to strip flesh from bone. And still, Shackleton dares to attempt it. Their mission sounds suicidal. A 2,900-kilometer trek through endless ice, blizzards, and darkness that lasts for months. A journey that would demand 120 days of non-stop marching across the coldest, most unforgiving continent on Earth. But the men on Endurance believe in their leader. They trust his courage, his experience, and his unshakable will. They believe that history will remember them as the first explorers to conquer Antarctica on foot. What they do not know, what none of them can yet imagine, is that within a year their mighty ship will be crushed like a toy in the jaws of the ice. They will be stranded on drifting floes, starving, freezing, and forgotten by the world. Shackleton's dream will sink into the abyss, and yet what follows is not a story of conquest, but of survival, one of the greatest survival stories ever told. This is the beginning of Shackleton's doomed expedition, and the extraordinary fight for life that would keep 28 men alive against the deadliest odds known to man. January 1915. The Endurance has pushed deep into the Weddell Sea, chasing Shackleton's impossible dream. But the ocean here is no longer water. It is a shifting, grinding wilderness of ice. Vast floes lock together like puzzle pieces, squeezing tighter each day.
No!
The ship groans, its timbers creak, and the men listen to the hull bend under the pressure of a frozen world. They are now prisoners. The sails hang limp, the rudder useless. Shackleton's crew can only watch as the ship is gripped, lifted, and twisted by slabs of ice heavier than mountains. The endless daylight of the Antarctic summer reveals a horizon with no escape, only a white desert stretching farther than the eye can see. Inside the trapped vessel, the men cling to routine. They tend to the sled dogs, sharpen tools, write in journals, trying to believe the ship will break free when the ice drifts. But deep down they know. The Weddell Sea does not release its prey, and yet Shackleton does not show fear. His voice is calm, his orders steady, his presence magnetic. He knows the truth, that leadership here is not about charts or maps, but about keeping 28 men from surrendering to despair. What began as a voyage of exploration has now become something else entirely. The Antarctic has set its trap. The question is no longer whether they will cross the continent, but whether they will live to escape the ice alive. By February 1915, the Endurance is no longer a ship. It is a wooden coffin trapped in a frozen tomb. The ice has closed around her, drifting with its own brutal will, carrying Shackleton and his men deeper into the Antarctic wilderness. They are passengers now, at the mercy of a continent that does not forgive. Day after day, the crew hears the groans of the hull as it bends under crushing pressure. At night, the sound is worse, like cannon fire echoing across the ice, as great slabs collide and splinter. The men wake in their bunks, wondering if the next shudder will be the one that splinters the ship into fragments. Rations are carefully measured. The sled dogs, restless and lean, snarl at the scent of scarce food. Temperatures plunge, the wind lashes at exposed skin, and every small task, hauling supplies, melting ice for water, simply stepping outside, becomes an act of endurance. Shackleton records in his diary with grim honesty, "The ship is imprisoned. Our fate is at the mercy of the ice." Yet in front of the men, he never falters. He cracks jokes, speaks of the coming spring thaw, keeps alive the fragile illusion of hope. But beneath the surface, a terrifying truth is dawning. The Endurance will not break free. The Antarctic has decided its verdict, and soon Shackleton will be forced to make an unthinkable choice. Abandon the ship, or watch his men die with it. October 1915. The Endurance groans like a living creature in its death throes. For months, the ice has tightened its grip, twisting the timbers, snapping beams, driving iron bolts through solid oak. The men stand helpless on the floe, listening as their only shelter, their only lifeline, is crushed before their eyes. With a deafening crack, the hull begins to splinter. Water floods in, freezing as fast as it enters, sealing the ship's fate. Shackleton gives the order no explorer ever wants to utter: abandon ship. The crew scramble to salvage what they can: food, tools, sledges, and the lifeboats that now mean the difference between survival and death. The once proud vessel that carried them across the seas is reduced to wreckage trapped in a white wasteland. The mast topples, swallowed by the pack ice, and the Endurance slips beneath, leaving only jagged timbers protruding like bones from a frozen grave. On the ice, the men watch in silence. The reality crashes in. There is no ship, no retreat, no escape but across hundreds of miles of shifting floes and deadly seas. Shackleton gathers his crew. His voice is steady, unyielding. Ship and stores are gone. Now we go home. At that moment, the expedition changes forever. They are no longer explorers chasing glory. They are castaways on the most hostile frontier on Earth, alone, exposed, and fighting for their lives. The men now live on the drifting ice itself, an endless, shifting desert of white. Their world is reduced to canvas tents, salvaged rations, and 3 lifeboats dragged like lifelines across the frozen surface. Temperatures plunge, winds scream, and the ice beneath them cracks without warning, splitting open into black chasms of seawater. Every night they sleep with the fear that the floe will shatter beneath their bodies. Food becomes a daily battle. The salvage stores dwindle, forcing them to hunt seals and penguins with rifles and harpoons. Seal blubber burns in makeshift stoves, choking the air with smoke but keeping frostbite at bay. Each mouthful of meat, greasy and raw, becomes the difference between strength and collapse. And still, Shackleton holds them together. He walks among the tents, joking with the men, sharing their meals, never showing despair. He knows that if morale breaks, survival breaks with it. The ice is merciless, but so is the silence of hopelessness, and Shackleton will not allow it. Weeks pass. The floe drifts aimlessly with the current, carrying them farther from safety, closer to the edge of the world. They know they cannot stay. The sea ice is thinning, breaking apart beneath their feet. The time is coming when they must gamble everything on the boats.
They must gamble
fragile
everything.
wooden shells against the most dangerous waters on Earth. Every day of waiting sharpens the same terrifying question. When the ice finally lets them go, will it free them or finish them? The lifeboats stagger across a sea that seems intent on swallowing them whole. Waves rise like walls, slamming down with a force that nearly splinters the fragile hulls. Salt stings their eyes, ice coats their beards, and every breath feels stolen from the storm. The men row until their muscles scream, then row again, knowing that pausing even for a moment could mean capsizing. Days blur into nights of endless cold. Sleep is a dangerous luxury. Frost creeps over their clothes, and seawater freezes in the seams of the boats. Hunger gnaws at them. Thirst burns worse than the icy air, and yet they cling to survival with raw stubbornness. Then, through the mist, a jagged coastline finally claws its way into view. Elephant Island. It is no paradise, just a barren outcrop of rock and ice. But to starving, exhausted men, it looks like salvation itself. The boats scrape ashore, men collapsing on the stones, their bodies trembling between relief and ruin. For the first time in more than a year, they stand on solid ground. Yet Shackleton knows this is not the end.
He knows.
Elephant Island is uninhabited, forgotten, and offers no rescue. They have escaped the sea, but they are still stranded at the edge of the world. On Elephant Island, the truth hit hard. The men were alive, but they were still trapped in a place no ship would ever pass by chance. Bitter winds ripped across the rocks, snow buried their tents, and the sea hammered the shoreline like an endless drum. They had food for weeks, maybe months, but certainly not enough for all. Slowly, fear began to whisper. Survival here would only delay the inevitable. Shackleton stood apart, watching his men. He knew waiting meant death. Rescue would not come to Elephant Island. They would have to go and fetch it themselves. So he made the hardest decision of the entire ordeal. He would take one lifeboat, hand-picked men, and sail nearly 800 miles of the most dangerous ocean on Earth to South Georgia. the nearest whaling station, the only hope of salvation. It was madness. The boat was small, the seas colossal. Navigation would have to be perfect, guided only by a sextant and rare glimpses of the sun between storms. But Shackleton's resolve was iron. He chose 5 men to join him, each one steady and strong. The rest, shivering on that desolate island, watched their leader prepare to vanish into the horizon. The odds were brutal. Yet as the James Caird lifeboat was hauled into the surf, Shackleton gave them what they needed most: a promise. I will come back for you. And in that moment, hope became their only fire against the cold. The James Caird lifeboat pushed into the roaring South Atlantic, swallowed by waves that towered like moving mountains. Shackleton and his 5 men bailed water with frozen hands, their clothes soaked, their faces burned raw by salt and wind. Day after day, storms hammered. Nights were worse, black, endless, with only the stars to remind them which way was east. One mistake, one broken oar, and the sea would erase them without a trace. Inside that fragile boat, survival depended on precision. Frank Worsley, the navigator, snatched seconds of sunlight through ragged clouds, taking readings with shaking fingers. A single miscalculation, even by a degree, and they would miss South Georgia completely, sailing instead into a death ocean with no return. Hunger gnawed at them. Sleep came in ragged scraps, and their bodies wasted away. But still they rode. Still they clung to the course. 2 weeks passed in this torment. 2 weeks of ice forming on their beards, of hands bleeding from ropes, of waves breaking over their heads. Yet somehow the tiny James Caird endured, a speck of wood and will in a sea built to destroy. And
South
then,
Georgia.
At last, a jagged shape rose on the horizon. South Georgia. Land. Safety. A miracle wrestled from the ocean itself. But the island's cliffs were sheer, its shores unwelcoming, and a final cruel truth awaited them. The whaling station, their salvation, lay on the far side, across mountains no man had ever crossed. Shackleton had delivered his men to land. Now he would have to lead them through the impossible once again. Exhausted, frostbitten, and half-starved, Shackleton and 2 of his strongest men left the James Caird behind on South Georgia's rocky shore. Ahead of them stretched mountains no human being had ever crossed, jagged peaks wrapped in glaciers, valleys buried under shifting snow, cliffs plunging into darkness. They had no maps, no ropes, no climbing gear, only an axe, a length of rope, and their will to survive. For 36 straight hours they marched, scaling ice walls and sliding down ridges, their boots torn and soaked, their beards stiff with frozen breath. Hunger clawed at their insides, and exhaustion begged them to stop. But stopping meant death. Shackleton drove them forward, every step carrying the weight of 28 lives waiting back on Elephant Island. At one point, they stood at the edge of a frozen ridge, fog curling below, the ground vanishing into silence. One misstep would send them plunging into the abyss. They roped themselves together, whispered a prayer, and slid down the ice in a desperate gamble. Somehow, impossibly, they survived. Then, as dawn broke, the sound of a distant whistle cut through the cold. A whaling station's morning call. Civilization, rescue, salvation. The 3 men staggered forward, tears freezing on their faces, knowing they had crossed the unthinkable. Shackleton had done the impossible again, but even in this moment of triumph, one thought consumed him. The rest of his crew, stranded on Elephant Island, were still waiting, and he would not rest until he brought them home. Shackleton burst through the doors of the whaling station, his face gaunt, his clothes in tatters, his eyes hollow from weeks of torment. The whalers stared in shock. This ghost of a man had come out of the mountains, speaking of a shipwreck, a crew stranded on a frozen island, a desperate fight against death itself. At last the world knew, but for Shackleton there was no time to rest, no time to bask in survival. His men, 22 souls, were still clinging to life on Elephant Island, watching the horizon each day, praying he would return. With borrowed ships, he launched rescue after rescue, only to be driven back by ice and storms. Each failure tore at him, but he refused to stop. Finally, after 4 relentless attempts, he broke through. On August 30th, 1916, the small lifeboats on Elephant Island spotted a silhouette on the horizon. Shackleton had come back. Not one man was lost. Every single crew member who had sailed with him into Antarctica walked away alive. It was more than survival. It was proof of unbreakable leadership, endurance, and loyalty in the face of impossible odds. Shackleton had not conquered Antarctica, but he had conquered despair. And in doing so, he carved his name into history. Not as a man who reached the South Pole, but as the man who refused to let his men die. The story of the Endurance was never about reaching a destination. It was about the will to keep going when nature, fate, and time itself conspired against you. And that is why, more than a century later, Shackleton's name endures, as the very definition of survival against the impossible.